there is still a gap into how these services, I would call them, public services, are discussed within the political space, in the electoral space.
आजकल हमारे देश में मुफ्त की रेवड़ी बांटकर वोट बटोरने का कल्चर लाने की भरसक कोशिश हो रही है। ये रेवड़ी कल्चर देश के विकास के लिए बहुत घातक है। इस रेवड़ी कल्चर से देश के लोगों को और खास करके मेरे युवाओं को बहुत सावधान रहने की जरूरत है। रेवड़ी कल्चर वाले कभी आपके लिए नए एक्सप्रेस वे नहीं बनाएंगे, नए एयरपोर्ट या डिफेंस कॉरिडोर नहीं बनवाएंगे।
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. This week we'll be talking about freebies, or as the Prime Minister likes to call it, the revri culture in the country. For a while now, especially since Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to power, he has talked about this issue a lot. It is at some level inconsistent with perhaps some of the things that he himself has decided and done in terms of policy choices. But broadly speaking, he came to power by berating the whole politics of dole at that time, as it was said, a sort of a policy choice which kept giving handouts to the poor. And that was his main criticism against the Congress-led UPA. And his point was that this disempowers people, and this keeps them actually artificially perhaps in that state, and that we should focus more on employment and getting better as an economy, getting stronger as an economy. Now, recently this thing has again, this issue has come up, and he's called it the reverie culture. Even the Chief Justice of the country has weighed in on this. Aam Aadmi Party head Arvind Kejriwal talked about it, saying that anybody who says anything against free education and health is a traitor. So there are all kinds of views flying around. And before we come to forming our own views, let's first understand this whole issue. What do we mean by reverie, or what do we mean by freebies? What are the economic underpinnings? Is there an economic definition to this? And to discuss this issue, I have a very special guest today. Please welcome Professor Dipa Sinha. She is assistant professor in the Ambedkar University. And hi, Dipa. Thanks for joining us on the Express Economist. And if I may, please correct me if I'm giving this a wrong information, but if I remember correctly, your PhD thesis was on comparing how public services were, dealt with in two states, I think Tamil Nadu and Uttar Pradesh, and which was a very interesting thing. I still remember because it's such a remarkable contrast of studies, because UP had a very different approach to how to win elections, or election time, what are the promises made, and Tamil Nadu had a very different culture of it. Now we see a lot of mishmash. We've seen in the recent past a lot of mishmash with UP chief ministers or hopefuls saying that we'll give out laptops, say Akhilesh Yadav, or even Yogi Adityanath saying, we'll give tablets to the youth. There have been numerous policies, I was just noting down all the policies that Government of India or states do. And it's very difficult to make sense of what is a freebie, what is a reverie, what is not a reverie between different schemes. So my first question to you is there an economic definition of freebies in the literature? Is there a way to sort of say, look at it, keeping aside all political views? Is there a way to say this is a freebie and that is not a freebie? Or is there a good freebie or a bad freebie?
So firstly, I think freebie is not a word that economists would use. Freebie would mean anything given for free. It doesn't have to be by the state. It could be by anybody. What economists would discuss would be subsidies, which is basically a spending that the government does for which it is not getting any immediate return. So it's not buying something, and usually also something that keeps the market prices of that good low. And in subsidies, of course, there is a lot of discussion on what are useful subsidies, like merit goods is one category that economics talks about, where things that the government spends on, which has sort of a community benefit, like say on education and health and so on, where it might not be an immediate return that you're getting, but overall the economy benefits from that kind of spending. And then there are others, of course, which some people would say are wasteful because they do not contribute to growth or development in any way. But beyond that, there is no clear list of, these are the list of things which are under, which could be merit goods, and these are the list of things which are not. Some things are definitely under merit goods, and there's no debate across economists of whatever ideological leanings that they might have, and education and health would clearly fit into that.
So that was the old merit subsidies argument, that elementary education, secondary education perhaps, or healthcare, any expenditure on that, on those fronts would be merit subsidies.
Absolutely. Yeah. Also because in the delivery of these kind of goods, it's been shown that markets fail. So one thing is coming in from the perspective of rights and justice and what the role of a state is in a democracy. But on the other hand, also that markets, the way we understand them, offer free competition, that they do not deliver these goods in an efficient manner, and therefore there is a need for some kind of an intervention.
So is this, I just want to be sure about this bit, from US or everywhere else, there has been this long debate there also, whether markets can deliver education or health, and those debates haven't died, it's still playing out. And somebody would say, I remember Milton Friedman's thing that, give vouchers and that will solve everything, either for health or education. And you don't need a whole bureaucracy to run for the government to provide education or provide health. If you could just share some understanding of what has been India's experience on this when we tried, say, RSBY, where maybe we tried to move to a point where government doesn't provide healthcare but pays for provisioning through the private sector. How did it pan out, or any other such example that you can give? Rashtriya Swasth Bima Yojana, for those who didn't understand RSBY. So if you could just reflect a bit about what is India's recent experience on this issue about markets not being able to deliver on certain counts, on certain sectors.
So like you say, firstly, before getting into that, the debate is on the delivery mechanism, but the fact that the government has to finance these things is not so much under debate. So when the government finances education and health, then does it run schools and hospitals, or does it give that money to people and say, okay, you go find your services, you buy them in the market? So in this context, like you said, I think the example that we have in India is the RSBY, which has now transformed itself into the Ayushman Bharat Pradhan Mantri PMJAY, which is basically an insurance-based scheme where the government pays the premium and enrolls beneficiaries. And if you fall sick, then up to an amount, you can go to accredited hospitals, and those could be government hospitals or private hospitals, and you get the service. So whatever, most of the studies that we have based on the experience of RSBY, and more recently fewer on PMJAY because that's a very new scheme, firstly show that one of the main objectives of these schemes is to reduce the out-of-pocket expenditure of people, that they don't spend on their healthcare out of their own pockets and the insurance pays for it, the whole cashless treatment. Most of the studies show that that did not happen. The second thing that you see is that from the supplier side, there is what is called cherry picking. So now, because there are profits to be made, there are certain kind of treatments which are more profitable, you find are covered more under RSBY. For instance, hysterectomies. Suddenly the number of hysterectomies go up. Yeah. Then there is also an equity angle to this, because in a country like India, where services are still not widespread, So when something like this comes in, it is those who are living in cities where healthcare, hospital facilities are already available, who are able to avail these services. But somebody living in a remote tribal block will still have to come all the way to the city to reach an accredited hospital to make use of this insurance. So studies which have looked at it from the point of view of equity find that geographically, socially, and in terms of economic class, this has been not a very equitable scheme. It is those who are slightly better off who are able to even take advantage of whatever the benefits are. So it clearly shows that in the Indian kind of situation where even markets have not penetrated everywhere, and these kind of services take even longer, such schemes do not work. We first have to create the social infrastructure for these services to be available to even get into this sort of debate on then making them available through like public financing and private provision.
Right. So, I mean, if we go back to the definition sort of we started off with, that those things on which, say, market fails and which, when the government invests in them, even subsidizes them, will have a huge community benefit. Now, that kind of a definition would leave a lot of government schemes out. A lot of things which even the current government is doing or many previous governments have done would go out of the window as reveries, right? I mean, say a PLI scheme, right, where the government sort of helping manufacturers. Why should that be justified under any subsidy? Or maybe cutting down taxes to incentivize production. If they are in the market sphere, that is a market. Or, for example, SOPs that we give to exporters. Many of those SOPs that are given could be justified saying that this is also reverie. Why are we giving exporters any benefit, any kind of tax exemption? Similarly, we hear about Infosys or any of these companies, their tremendous growth. But the fact is that they were in their initial phases, especially, given a huge tax benefit, a lot of, so you were engendering some kind of growth in them when they were in the market sphere, and there's no reason why that. So how does one go about figuring out then which part is the reverie in the rest of it? Suppose health and education, suppose we keep out. Okay, that is not even up for debate. That has to be done. Otherwise, what is the point of a government? That outside that, how do we go about?
So I'm glad also the kind of examples that you gave, which usually people would not think of at all when you think about freebies or subsidies, right? And each of these, like I said in the beginning, you can't have a hard and fast rule of this is good and this is not good. One looks at the state of the economy, what the priorities of should be for the government in terms of boosting the economy, and within that, then which of these are justifiable and which of these are not. Also, economists often talk about this contradiction between efficiency and equity, right? Which doesn't need to be there. It's a hugely debatable area, but generally that there is some sort of a contradiction that to get more efficiency, you give up some amount of equity. If we think of it from that lens, then where you draw the line and what makes the balance, of course, is determined by political priorities through the political processes. But we have to understand, therefore, that certain things, certain kinds of subsidies to the corporate sector, let's say, or incentives, are justified giving the argument that they enhance growth. But somebody else might say that a different kind of subsidy, let's say the PDS or the Narega, might not have the same impact on overall economic growth. Maybe you'll have a 0.2% lower growth, but that growth goes in a larger proportion to those who are in the, say, bottom 2 quintiles in the income, and would say that in the longer run, that is something that is more beneficial. So those are the kind of things that come into play when you decide which is more desirable or not. And ultimately, it really, for me, also goes into then that whole debate around what is the role of growth itself. I mean, the difference between growth and development. And if you understand development as something broader, then many more priorities come in. And then it's not so easy that anything that contributes to immediate economic growth is a good thing. And something where you can't show that immediate relation is necessarily a freebie or something that is a drain on the economy.
Right. Now, one thing is, I'll come to your, I wanted to ask you what what do you think is a wasteful, or what would you call a revri in the current scenario? And I want to hear that because you've tracked many of these schemes. But before that, if you could just reflect a bit, because you looked at different states dealing with this issue of what to promise to gain political power. And that is at the heart of the matter here, although we are trying to discuss only the economics of it, but the debate is because of what people offer to gain political power. From your own PhD experience and otherwise from your experience tracking these issues, what have you found? Say, which state does what? And even if you could give me one or two examples about how did that differ? Say UP, if it in such a big state, how did their strategy or their political approach to welfarism was different from, and how did it play out in, say, UP's growth or lack of it?
So if I take Tamil Nadu and UP itself as examples, what you see is that Tamil Nadu has had this politics of welfarism for much longer, from the 60s itself. The Dravidian parties always had this aspect to them, which is to do with a certain kind of history that they came up with, also to do with how women were part of the political process. And some of these issues are seen as being more directly reaching out to women. For instance, when Kamraj started the midday meal scheme, one of the things he said was that he was trying to wipe the tears of the mother who was not able to feed her child, and that her time is saved and she is kind of protected because the child will get the meal in the school. So if you look at it from a slightly longer perspective, you see that things like even education and health became political issues in some of the southern states much earlier than in the northern states. So even there, it started off with things like free books, free uniforms, schools, of course, cycles. All of these really contributed to universal enrollment of girls in schools, keeping them there. And then, of course, health. Even if you look at the public distribution system, it was in the early 80s that this 2 rupees, 2 rupee chawal became a political issue, again in the southern states first. In the Hindi belt, you see a slightly different kind of politics, where it is with the upcoming of parties like the Samajwadi or BSP, which were representing the marginalized, be it BCs or Dalits, that even there, that the initial issues that they took up were more to do with symbolic cultural identity, the statues and so on, which also I think they fit into the political process where they do. It was a fight for dignity, but that link that a state like Tamil Nadu was able to make between that fight for dignity and access to education and health and so on is something that we even now don't see as much in states like, say, UP. And I think that is broadly for me sort of the difference, where now more from the central government, things like PDS and so on have come into UP politics. But there is still a gap into how these services, I would call them, public services, are discussed within the political space, the electoral space particularly.
Right. I mean, so this is quite remarkable, and that's where I would want you to next comment on that. When you look at the landscape, I mean, even the current government, and this is not this is just to understand who's doing what. Is there an economic thinking here? Or is this just political opportunism between one political party and another? When you see the landscape of what the central government is doing and some of the state governments are doing, do you see a massive difference that, one is following strict fiscal rectitude approach and the other is just giving out reveries? Is that, or is a massive mismatch of, everybody trying to do whatever they can to stay in power?
I think the latter, because actually, even if you look at how it works in India, most of the fiscal space still lies with the central government. It is true that state governments do their schemes and so on, but even now, more so now with GST, they have very little space to raise their own revenues and fund this. And even the FRBM is more strictly implemented vis-a-vis the state governments than the center. So the center definitely has greater space. And one can say that even something like the PM Kisan or the PMGKY, which is the free food grains as a result of COVID relief, I'm in support of these schemes. But people could argue in this logic that these are freebies and wasteful. And if you then start putting the amounts that are spent on these, it would be the central government much more than the state. So I don't think it's a center state thing, and it's not even a party thing. BJP in many states has been doing many of these schemes. The UPA also did it. Many of the regional parties do it. Some things of this sort of distribution of TV sets and gold chains, this was something that Tamil Nadu sort of is a leader in, one could say. I think what is even more striking is when you think of the broader economic policy in terms of your tax policy or your willingness to tax the rich or corporate profits, it's more or less the same across parties. And I think that's where the unanimity sort of comes. And then it is the electoral kind of pressures which makes them keep doing something, because we do have a growth process which has a lot of losers. And the politics has to answer for that some way.
Yeah, and I agree with that. It's quite remarkable, the stark opacity that is there in electoral bonds and all those fundings, to at the same time also be talking about how giving some freebies, so-called quote-unquote freebies, is used or misused the electoral process, as I think one of the petitioners in one of the cases has argued. Right, and because, if you look at from corporate taxes to exemptions to different sectors to credit guarantees, even a free bank account, nothing is free. When you ask millions to be enrolled in public sector banks for a free bank account, that is not a free operation. So somebody is paying the cost, and that could be also construed as a freebie. So it's a very difficult definition to sort of arrive at and say what is a freebie and what is not. There are merit subsidies and non-merit subsidies, as Dipa explained. But one has to understand what is, also the role and the state of the current Indian economy, how many are poor and how desperate they are to even get 2 square meals or some decent education. And one has to perhaps make up their own mind on what they consider to be a reverie and what they consider to be a genuine expenditure by the government on a scheme that may have huge benefit. I remember from one of the pieces that I wrote that every $1 that you spent on health in India typically gave you almost $9 of benefits later on in terms of better productivity, lower healthcare costs. So I hope this episode has explained some of these contours to our viewers. Thanks, Dipa, for sparing your time and being on the Express Economist. If you like the show, hit the like button, subscribe us, and we'll be back next Friday. Thank you.